Hi, everyone. We're back for round 3. This is still in chapter 1 for Bio 113. Now we were talking about microbes and disease. Honestly, I'm guessing that a lot of you are a lot more interested in this topic than you were in the history of life on Earth that we talked about in the last micro lecture. So this is just sort of an overview of how microbes are associated with disease, right? Again, these are slides from chapter 1 of your textbook, right? So how do we know that microbes cause disease? Well, it hasn't always been clear. In fact, it's only been clear for about the last 130 years of human history that people have accepted, not everybody, but most people have accepted that infectious diseases, at least, are caused by microorganisms that we can't see with our naked eye. Now, I do want to emphasize that we're talking about infectious diseases here. There are other kinds of genetic metabolic diseases, cancer, for example, diabetes, that are not caused by infectious organisms. Although, I should say that some kinds of cancer have been linked with certain viruses, for example, even some with bacteria. But we're talking here about standard infectious diseases that can be transmitted from one person to another, okay? People used to believe that infectious diseases were associated with angry gods or bad air or other natural or supernatural causes, right? And people have been suffering from diseases ever since civilization started. I mean, a lot of infectious diseases only really got going when people came together into communities and villages and towns, right, where they could easily transmit diseases from person to person. But diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis and leprosy and sexually transmitted diseases, viral diseases like malaria, they've been around, for thousands of years since people started getting together in communities. And obviously they were around because humans are evolved from apes, and those apes have diseases too, right? So it's not like we've ever been out without infectious disease. All right, anyway, let's go on to the next slide. How do we actually know that infectious diseases are caused by microbes? So this is actually first shown in the 1880s by a German scientist named Robert Koch. Okay, Robert Koch, through his so-called Koch's postulates that we'll talk about later in the class, came up with a sort of a systematic way of demonstrating that an isolatable bacteria was responsible for a specific disease. And he first showed this with Bacillus anthracis that causes anthrax, which is a disease both of humans and of livestock, and also with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which causes the disease tuberculosis. Those were the first two infectious diseases he proved it for. Not long after that, he proved it with cholera, and other diseases were demonstrated. Now, first bacterial diseases, and then later viral diseases. And the reason for that is that it's much harder to isolate and culture viruses. That wasn't done until the 1930s and 40s, really. So it was bacterial diseases that were first shown to be, or bacteria that were first shown to be the causes of specific infectious diseases, right? So this is Robert Koch in his microscope, and Koch's postulates is something we're going to talk more about in chapter 18. But Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur were really the sort of the founders of the field of microbiology. All right, infectious diseases are still with us, and they are complicated. They're not the same all over the world. We have different diseases because there's a lot of different factors that affect infectious diseases. Those of you who are public health majors don't need to be convinced about the social determinants of health and environmental determinants of health. Infectious diseases are affected by geographic, environmental, cultural, economic differences, which can mean different rates of diseases around the world. You see here, if we look at the rate of infectious diseases in the world overall versus the poorest parts of the world, which largely in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that even relatively recently, this only goes up to about 20 years ago, but the rates of deaths from infectious diseases are still quite high, whereas in the more affluent parts of the world, they've gone down dramatically. Now, they're not completely gone here. I don't want you to think they're completely gone. In fact, I'm going to skip over that one for a second. If we look at the rate of infectious deaths from infectious diseases in the United States, you can see that over the last century, they have dropped dramatically from 800 deaths per 100,000 population down to on the order of 20 to 30. So almost 2 orders of magnitude. You can see here that it's not continuous. There's a big spike here in around 1918. Hopefully most of you know where that was from. If not, do some research on it, right? We're going to get back to this in just a second. Just to illustrate, though, some of the impacts that microbial infectious diseases have had on human history. The classic example is bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, which is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. This hit Europe coming from China and India in the mid part of the 14th century, so around 1347 it was first seen. So it came along trade routes, basically up through the Mediterranean into the port of Marseille and in Italy. In late 1347, by mid 1348, it had spread across Italy into Central Europe, into France, into Spain. Of course, all the boundaries of these countries weren't the same then as they are now. But then by the end of that year, 1348, it spread further. You can see this sort of chronological progression across Europe from south to north. During this about half a decade, from 1347 to 1353 or so, it's estimated that at least 20 million, maybe as 50 million people in Europe died. So that was probably about a quarter to a third of the population of Europe. And this had tremendous impacts. And in fact, it was probably the plague, the impacts of the plague were one of the things that caused Europe to transition from what we often call the medieval period, the Middle Ages, to the Renaissance over the next couple of centuries. It shook up societal structures, political structures, etc. Right? So this was tremendously important. The underlying basis for the plague, which of course people didn't know then, is that this bacteria was carried by fleas. Fleas were living on rats. Rats were living on the ships that were coming through the trade routes into Southern Europe, right? When the rats, which got the plague as well, eventually died, the fleas would jump off of the now cold rats and onto the next warm body. If that warm body happened to be a human, because cities at this time were densely crowded, filthy places, then that flea, it would bite that human to get its blood meal. It wasn't its favorite host, but if that's where it ended up, that's what it would do, right? So then the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, would start replicating in the humans. It can be passed by fleas to other humans, or it could actually be passed directly to humans through a process called the pneumonic plague, where it was actually exhaled out as a respiratory disease, which was very dangerous, right? So this was the underlying basis. Humans didn't know this until the early 1900s, when a scientist named Alexander Yersin, which is what what the bacteria is named after, discovered this. Interestingly, there was a very cool book that came out last year. If you want to read it, it's called Black Death at the Golden Gate. It's about the plague epidemics in San Francisco at the end of the 19th century, in the early parts of the 20th century. The plague came from China through Hawaii to the Western United States with Chinese immigrants, came into the population there. Fascinating story about the society then, which was highly discriminatory against Chinese. It took years to figure out what was causing the plague and how to deal with it. And it wasn't actually eliminated in San Francisco until after the 1906 earthquake. But it's, again, a fascinating story of the interplay between societal factors and different ethnic groups and discrimination, and how it was very hard to get rid of this disease because people had blinders on about what was causing it and who was responsible, etc. But I definitely recommend reading that book if you're interested in that interplay. Amazing public health story, and still lessons for us today, obviously. Anyway, getting back here, I want you to actually think now about, and maybe reflecting on the story with the plague, why did rates of infectious disease go down so much in the last century? There are some obvious answers. I know some of you are thinking, but I want you to take a few minutes now in the breakout groups and talk about why we might have seen such a dramatic drop in the US and in large parts of the world from infectious diseases. All right, so take a break now, go into your breakout groups, discuss this, come up with, say, at least 5 reasons that you think are very important for the decline of infectious diseases in the United States in the 20th century. All right, wrapping this up now, we obviously have not eliminated infectious diseases. Antibiotics and vaccines have not gotten rid of them. I know those were probably 2 of your top answers as to why diseases have gone away, but they're only part of the story. We still see new infectious diseases now. Ebola, for example, was discovered in the middle part of the 20th century, but in 2014 in West Africa, over 11,000 people died from about a 2-year-long Ebola outbreak. HIV probably came into the human population in the 20th century. We're going to talk about that later on too, because the evolution of HIV is a fascinating story. But really it was recognized in the 1980s as a disease that destroys your immune system. Since then, in the last few decades, over 75 million people have been infected and 33 million people have died. We have good drugs for HIV, but we still don't have a vaccine for it, right? And then obviously we're living in the COVID era. That's why we're doing this class online right now. SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus that causes a disease that's now called COVID, for coronavirus disease, or COVID-19, coronavirus disease 2019. SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. CoV stands for coronavirus. Came along at the end of 2019, and so far in 2020, more than 30 million people are known to have been infected. Probably the real number is at least twice that. And close to 1 million people have died from COVID-19 already. We don't have any good drugs for it yet. They're being developed. We hope that a vaccine will be along soon. But infectious diseases are here with us to stay. So we need to understand how these microbes work. That's the end of this micro lecture, and we'll get back in